It was just a few months ago, Prime Minister Mark Carney told Canadians the biggest threat to our country was China. And here we are in January 2026, and Prime Minister Carney and a bunch of very important politicians in this country are in China begging for their money and their business. Well, should we be concerned as Canadians? To talk more about it, thrilled to be joined by a former national security analyst and the author of an impactful and incredible new book called Under Assault, that's available on Amazon.ca and Chapters Indigo, Dennis Molinaro. Dennis, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for being on with us. And I guess before we get to the nuts and bolts of the book, there was an anecdote today before you joined us where reporters were questioning Melanie Joly that they were forced to bring burner phones to Beijing for the meeting for the fear of security and spying on by the People's Liberation Government of China. This is the kind of thing that goes on routinely. How concerned should we be as Canadians that Prime Minister Carney and the Canadian government are trying to get so in bed with their government for the sole purpose of business and money?
I think Canadians have a right to be concerned. And I mean, just by virtue of the fact that those, like you said, those politicians needed burner phones, that tells you a lot right there of the kind of country that you're dealing with. In other words, that this is not a country that is or should be regarded the same as any other Western nation when it comes to trade, or as a viable replacement for trade with our closest trading partner, the United States. The fact that politicians have to be so careful about their security, use burner phones when they're over there, it begs the question of, is this really the kind of partnership, that you're seeking here with this guy, with a country like this?
We're seeing it in so many different businesses that we're turn a blind eye to China and their practices because of the money. The NBA is deep ties to China. We're seeing it with movies. John Cena actually voiced, I believe, was a Mandarin apology for a comment he made about Chinese theater, so they didn't lose the Chinese movie industry. What is it about the China and their economy that people are blind to all the bad things that they do?
I think part of it has to do with a little bit of nostalgia, going back to the 90s, right? There's that period of time where China's economy opened up, and I think that's where a lot of these types of impressions about the potentials of China, that's really when it started to really take off. And the United States was very similar to Canada in that respect, in terms of this fear of missing out and getting into China as quickly as possible to do business there. And so both countries were, guilty of that. But I think that's where it kind of really took off, and it's lingered ever since. And it's been really difficult to change the narrative on that, in spite of all the activities that China's been doing. I think that's going to start changing, especially as the temperature ramps up, with Taiwan. I think we're going to be forced to a moment of realization of what China actually is.
I've heard this from different sources, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but China plays the long game, that they're willing to spend 10, 20, 30 years getting their hooks into a business or a country or a culture for their benefit. But I was shocked with your book and your research, which is incredible, that the ties from China to Canada date back to the 70s.
Oh yeah, it dates right back to the very, I would say, beginning of when the PRC is recognized by the West. Now, other countries recognized China before Canada. I mean, the UK did, France did. But what's important to note is that recognition wasn't so, I guess you could say, focused or heavily dealing on the Taiwan issue. The UK really skirted it. France skirted it as well. Whereas Canada made this point to note the PRC's position when it comes to Taiwan. And that's important because that recognition language was really what the United States ended up adopting years later. And it's also important because my research dug into the very real possibility and likelihood that recognition was actually a foreign interference operation, a foreign influence operation by China against Canada and its leadership.
Well, that raises a very good point, that it was even acknowledged in the last election that China's influence on our federal elections in the last decade are very, very strong. And then we saw an individual, potential MP, who had to step down because of ties to China. For the uninitiated, checking this out, listening to your interview, Dennis, how deep are the Chinese government's ties to our country when it comes to election time?
I think we have I think Canadians should be rightly concerned. I mean, this came out in the Hogue inquiry where we heard that there was interference in at least 2 elections that we know of, federal elections. We know that they're going back to the 1970s. Like I said in the book, there was an attempt to influence the governments at the time. Even from my interviews from politicians who were on the ground in the 80s, in the 90s, they had talked about the fact that influence attempts were known at the time, that they were trying to be influenced, that there was attempts to influence. So this has been going on a long time, and that's a real problem. And so the question then becomes, what are we doing about it? And what is being done about it? It's one thing where you can say, well, maybe we didn't know, we didn't have the research, we didn't dig into it, but we've dug into it. The research has been done. It's very public. And that begs the question again of what's happening. I mean, we heard during the Hogue inquiry about all these different networks and proxies and what have you so what's happened with them? To go into China now, talking about partnership and strategic partnerships and ignoring essentially all the security elements and risks that have taken place here and not doing anything to protect Canadians from them begs the question of how seriously does the government take the threat of China? And what does that mean for our position with the United States?
And I guess that was my next question too, Dennis, is I get the hesitancy to keep doing business with the United States, considering the current administration, what Donald Trump has done, the way he's treated Canada privately and publicly. But are there not other countries and other economies that we can form a relationship with other than China to benefit Canada?
Absolutely, there are. I mean, and this is a bit of the problem I have with what's happening here is that, and the way really that the argument and the positions are being framed. This is one administration. This is one American administration that our current government has a problem with. It's not Americans, right? It is not the American people. It is not businesses. It is not. It's you have disagreements with other governments all the time, and I think those can be hammered out and hashed out. But to seek partnerships with countries that are adversaries of the West is not the solution. Because if we want to talk about diversifying trade from the United States, sure, we should have been doing that a long time ago, just as an independent nation. But the realities are that previous prime ministers have tried to do that repeatedly and failed. And I think largely because how difficult it is, because of geography, because of the realities of where we are, the culture, the integration, what have you. So they never really sought to do this. And this is something that would take decades to do anyways. It's not going to happen in Carney's 4-year term, or it's just not possible. So really, I would say part of the other problem is we talk about diversified trade with the United States, but what about from China? Why are we not looking for other purchasers of canola besides China, which has weaponized canola against us before? It did it in 2019 when we had the dispute with the Michaels and Meng Wanzhou's arrest. So why go back to the same market that we know will weaponize it again? It's and be forced into this false choice of East versus West Canada or China versus the United States.
Speaking of Dennis Molinaro, the former national security analyst and noted author and academic, and the author of an incredible new book called Under Assault. And I think the term assault, Dennis, but there's also different ways to do it, because you see the proliferation of fentanyl labs in North America and Canada, money laundering in Canada. Those all add up to hurt us as a country.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the threat is multifaceted and it's a multi-pronged threat. I mean, the laundry list is enormous, whether it's precursors of fentanyl, whether it's things like money laundering, whether it's, giving up secrets and biotechnology secrets from the Winnipeg lab, cyber attacks against this country, foreign interference and influence against elections. That's a handful right there. And those things have gone on for years.
And you talk about in the book, and I almost forgot about this, that Nortel was plundered of intellectual property by digital spies. And that's the one thing I've heard from different experts, as well as yourself, all of your peers, that China and the Chinese government think nothing of robbing someone's intellectual property and using it for their benefit and basically creating their version of whatever product they plunder.
Yeah, and that's really the kind of myth exposed, you could say, when it comes to China, because there is that tendency for businesses, and as it was put to me with one interview subject in the book, where they said, you go to China thinking that you're going to get rich, you're going to do business, things are going to take off. You build your factory, and across the street, in very short order, the competing factory is built that has the same technology and IP you were using. Workers are cheaper to pay them, and you go out of business, and you have to leave. And this happens repeatedly. So again, it relies on, to go into China thinking you're going to get rich and this is going to pay off, relies on a level of ignoring the realities and the past. And I feel that that's what the Canadian government has done a lot of, which is believing what it wants to believe with China, hearkening back to nostalgia rather than facing the reality that it should be facing.
And I was just thinking while you're saying that it's one of the great jokes from Ricky Gervais in the Golden Globes a few years ago, looking at Tim Cook talking about slave labor to make iPhones. And, he looked uncomfortable and there was the nervous laughs, but there was so much truth to that. But people are still buying their iPhones built in China.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was a whole book about Apple in China. So it's again, it's that allure, right? That there's profit, there's money to be made, when in reality, you have to understand that the PRC is interested in its own interests, and it will do whatever it can to benefit those interests. And it does have the benefit to where, in that sense, to accomplish it, its leadership is, it's a one-party system. That party does not change. The leaders change. And that's why, you could see it as something to the effect of playing the long game versus Western nations that have an election every 4 years, because their mission, their desire is longer, right? If they're going to replace Western hegemony in the globe and to try to retake Taiwan, or conquer Taiwan, not retake, conquer it, that's going to take a long time. And that's something that passes over from one leader to the next.
10 years ago, the thought of China being able to conquer Taiwan and absorb it into the one China policy, I kind of shook my head and said, I don't think they could do it. They have built so many tanks and planes and ships and so much military hardware in the last decade that they now have the capabilities, so much so to do it. If that happens, and that's their goal, they've made no bones about it. What does Canada do with their business ties? Does that mean they stopped doing business with China because they invaded Taiwan?
Well, this is the situation, right? This is a situation that we would be putting ourselves in if we seek some kind of enlarged partnership with the PRC. Now, we don't know when they want to attempt to do this. They've made it clear, though, that Xi Jinping has made it clear that he wants reunification to happen under his watch. And you're right about the buildup. The buildup from China is the largest military buildup that a country's ever engaged in since Germany in the Second World War. You don't build a military like this and be engaged in a massive buildup unless you intend to use it. And alongside that, they have expanded that dual use kind of philosophy when it comes to building civilian ships. So you have Coast Guards, for instance, ships that are built, a ton of them that are being built that are going to be in service and are in service of the PLAN. So that's important to note as well. They're utilizing those ships and those boats for their military purposes as well.
Because I read somewhere that they're building ferries like we would use to go from New Brunswick 100%. To PEI that could be converted to troop ships that day.
Yes, absolutely. They are doing that, and they have done that. So they have greatly expanded the size of their Navy and landing craft as well, amphibious landing craft to be able to land, do an island invasion. One of their most recent, essentially, blockade drills of the island was condemned internationally. It just happened right over the holiday break. So this is a very real threat that they are actively pursuing, a real policy that they are actively pursuing, and it's a threat to us. It's also a threat to places like Japan. If there is that attempt to try to take Taiwan, that puts direct security pressures and threats to the Japanese, which is why they've been so vocal about actually protecting Taiwan.
Dennis, so much has been made since Carney arrived in China about net zero in the climate and the environment, and doing work with China for the environment and climate and net zero. And even the most pro-liberal supporter out there would have to say, wait a second, China's the worst polluter in the world. So how can they spin that they're hoping to get net zero in a business relationship with China when China pollutes more than any country in the world?
Well, they've already thrown that out the window. The ability to use that net zero argument is gone. And the reason it's gone is because just today they announced a MOU with expanding oil and natural gas sales to China. Okay. So you can't be talking out of both sides of your mouth at the same time. I mean, if you're saying net zero and yet you're going to expand gas and oil sales to China, those two things don't line up. Now, again, it's not unheard of. I mean, the United States sells to China as well. They've just promised also to expand uranium sales, from what I understand as well. It's not that we haven't sold uranium to China before. The problem is the language and these types of agreements that's coming around it, and the idea that China is a great alternative to the United States. That's really how it's being pitched. I mean, you see these kinds of posts on X that Mark Carney is doing right now, trying to, and Melanie Jolie and Anita Anand is saying that, well, this is things like this is a new era. What does that mean? Because all the existing threats are still there. They haven't been dealt with. So what kind of a new era is this? And that's the problem, that's the real problem I have with what's been happening.
There's also talk about reducing tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles and electric vehicle plants. And Doug Ford, I mean, I don't agree with everything he says, but when he says that could be a gut blow to the Ontario automobile industry, I kind of agree with him.
Oh, he's right about that. He's 100% right about that. He's wrong, though, when he talks about inviting investment from China as an alternative to that. So that's where I think his lines are crossed, and he's either not getting the full story about how the PRC operates, or he doesn't understand how they operate. And again, it goes back to this failure to understand the way China operates. So if China were to invest in Ontario in a plant or what have you, one, the EV industry is a strategic one for China. So 100% there's going to be some government involvement in whatever company is operating. So you're probably going to have a company that has at least the CCP has what's called a golden share of that company to exert some type of control over them or leverage. So you're going to be inviting the Communist Party to invest in Ontario. Alongside that, they are more than likely, as they've done elsewhere in the world, would bring in their own labor to construct that factory and use their own technology, which would completely shut out.
Sorry, in Ontario.
In Ontario, 100%. They've been doing that around the world. They did it in Brazil, where they would bring in their own workers to basically construct the place. And so Canadian labor would be totally cut out of that. And then I would not be surprised either if they brought in their own workers to run in there, to work in it. So where's the benefit to Canada? And alongside that, you would be bringing in an ally of Russia, an ally of Iran and North Korea into the Ontario market and supply chain integrated with the United States. And how does anybody think the US is going to react to PRC technology and cars and equipment being integrated into a North American market?
Well, I mean, even if Gavin Newsom and the Democrats were the current administration, they'd have a problem with it, not just Trump.
And this is the failure of Canadian policymakers today to really understand this, and people who are parroting a success in traveling and doing more business with China. What they seem to fail to grasp is that national security in the United States is much, much more nonpartisan than it has been in Canada. And you see the consistency across administrations. When Trump put in place tariffs against the PRC, Biden continued a number of them and even increased them. The arrangement with tariffs on EVs was not done under the Trump administration. It was done between the Canadian administration and the Biden administration. So if Canada backpedals on an agreement with an ally for the protection of supply chains and industry and national security with the United States, they would, in my opinion, they would be handing a justification to the US to keep tariffs under national security grounds. If they thought the argument was flimsy under fentanyl, they would strengthen it by doing this. And I'm quite confident that Democrats would be put in a position where they'd say, well, we can't really help you because you made your bed.
Dennis, I mean, obviously your depth of knowledge, your experience and everything is the reason you are what you are. There are other people like you in Canada. And I don't think Mark Carney and his inner circle are dumb people. So why don't they listen to national security experts like you and others before getting into bed with the Chinese government so much?
It's a good question that I wish I had an answer to. But it's something that, politicians and governments have their own agendas and their own view of the world, I guess you could say, and try as you might sometimes to dislodge that or inform it. If they're determined to do what they're going to do for whatever reason they have to do it, you're kind of stuck on the outside looking in.
Because I look at this deal now and say, for sake of argument, we have an election later this calendar year. It almost is Carney and China against whomever and another country. I mean, would that not be a massive election issue for a lot of Canadians, this arrangement today?
It should be a massive election issue. My concern is that what's being ramped up to justify it is anti-Americanism. That's being whipped up to justify this turn and direction towards the PRC, when really it should be about, there's an opportunity in general here where Canada could take a position of diversifying itself from everyone, to become more self-reliant, to become a stronger country in terms of its relations with the world, vis-a-vis the United States, China, everyone. But instead, there's this false dichotomy that's being presented as if we need to latch on to one superpower or another. And I don't feel that that's the choice that should be put before Canadians. It should be actually one that supports a strong, independent Canada from everyone instead.
I couldn't agree more. The book is called Under Assault by Dennis Molinaro, available in Chapters Indigo, Amazon, wherever you get your books. I cannot recommend it enough. And your eyes will be open to this country's relationship with China and what it means to us going forward. Dennis, thank you so much for taking the time and educating me and everybody else. It was greatly appreciated, and it was something that will be a big story in the weeks to come.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate being on the show. It was great.